Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We've got another episode of the Modern Mobile Oilfield, and this actually is the second part of an episode addressing how your organization or yourself can tackle the data monster. So if you did miss part one, you'll want to watch that, as it does address the importance of data quality and why it will have a growing role in the oil and gas industry. And also, before we get into it, you know we've got a YouTube channel, but perhaps you don't know that it's been getting better. Look at it last episode, for example. Sure, some hiccups, but we're even sure to improve from that. So we're going to keep moving forward. We hope you keep moving forward with us, and you definitely won't be as entertained if you're just listening. Don't get me wrong, we appreciate the support, but we want you to get the most out of this. So go ahead and search Rare Petcher on YouTube. But that is all for the housekeeping, and it is time we get into the episode. You ready, Jeffrey?
I am as ready as I'm going to be, so rock and roll.
Alrighty, so we have explained how data may appear intimidating at first, but there are ways to make it work for you. I know we've given a great bird's eye view of how to go about that, but let's make use of one of my classic hypotheticals. I'm an organization who is ready to embrace the change of data management, and I watched the video, the last episode that Tavis and Jeffrey did, and I thought they had some pretty good points. So I've got my boxes, my old drives, my multiple databases, and I'm quite simply overwhelmed. How might I even begin to think about a plan for transforming and cleaning this data from a logistics perspective?
Well, to begin, the challenge of most organizations will face is that they don't really know what data holdings they actually have, and they're not sure of the quality of the data that they have, and they don't have a clear line of sight as to what they're going to do with that data when and if they had it in hand. So the first task or order of business is to go and just get your arms around the data holdings that you have. Most managers and supervisors and employees will know where the most valuable data sets are and which ones they consistently rely on. So there's task one. Go and build that index of data that you have in hand. Second is frequently the data that is in hand is not set up or structured in a fashion that it actually can be useful. As an example, a major capital project will hand data over to the operator at the end of that project, but the data will have been built for the constructor of the asset, not necessarily the guys and gals who have to operate the asset. So sometimes data structure is going to become a problem. And then, of course, there's this even broader challenge of how do you manage and get your arms around the kinds of practices that make a lot of sense in managing data assets. And for that, what I recommend is that companies go and look at or consult with those organizations that are really, really good at this. And they may not be companies that are in oil and gas. It may be that you go and speak with the likes of Amazon or Google or Microsoft. These organizations specialize in helping other organizations manage and administer large data sets. And in the case of Amazon, they have their own enormous data set collections that they administer. So looking to others outside the industry actually is a really, really good practice to help answer this challenge of managing data.
So it sounds like getting a handle on what data is available and what it can accomplish is clearly the first step. Next, I would imagine the goals and the structure of the data plan will have to be relayed to employees and not just whoever's at the top. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's precisely correct. You know, the behaviors that have contributed to poor quality data and that are deeply seated in organizations have to be changed if you hope or expect that the quality of the data at that point forward is going to somehow get better. So companies have to take a close look at what it is that drives the poor quality data in their organizations and do what they can to move it forward. And I would point out, most of the time, this is not the frontline employees' fault. They're doing their very, very best to do their jobs and be successful and help the company move forward. But if you have a mobile app that has a whole bunch of fields to be filled in, and you don't provide simple things like drop-down lists with correct data that employees can just select, it should be no surprise that a finger in the cold weather is going to choose the wrong data. So, you know, this is a responsibility for management to do everything they can to help move the quality of the data up. But it does really start with bigger questions like who actually is responsible here and has to take accountability for information and asset quality. is it the IT function? Is it their job, or is it the line of business manager whose business unit is more dependent on the data? Are there guidance and incentive structures in place that motivate and reward the right sorts of things like high quality information assets? And when I think about who's really good at this, it might not be organizations in oil and gas. It may very well be organizations outside of this industry.
Perfect. So I've addressed a sort of roadmap for my organization, and I do remember how much you would stress standardization earlier in that last episode. So how do I frame my organization's goals and objectives for data acquisition and organization as we move forward?
Well, at first blush, the simple answer is to land on what it is, the attributes of that data that you're looking to assemble or to collect. What do you want it to the characteristics that you want it to evidence? And here's just a few examples. The data should be highly reliable. The data should be suffer from or have very, very low levels of duplication. Remember the early, in the previous episode, we talked about redundant, obsolete, and trivial data. So what practices are in place so that redundant data is identified quickly and removed, that you're only going to a single point of reference for any particular data element that you're keeping track of. The accountability for that data. It's a really interesting question, when you think about it. Imagine an upstream company that wants to drill a well. Well, who's responsible for for owning the well? I wrestled with this question in Australia because the industry there was delivering lots and lots of wells, but who actually created a well? And in Australia's context, the well was created when the bulldozer showed up at the site and began clearing land. It was at that point that a true well was going to be produced, because up until that point, the well was an artifact that might exist on paper or on a plan, but it wasn't a real well. And so it's really critical to ask those questions. When does this data start to originate, and therefore who has accountability for creating it? Then we get into this question of how do you protect that data? When do you know, and what is its life cycle? When is it something you're going to dispense with or get rid of? And going back to my well example, once a well is abandoned and it's been shut in, is it still a well? Or is it still a real thing for you? These are some of these wrestling questions. And typically in upstream oil and gas, you go from department to department. There will be like 30 definitions of wells, and you can't even get your hand around a simple answer to that kind of question. So clear accountability, a life cycle, knowing what the data should look like and who's created it. And then, of course, who and how do people have access to that data, under what conditions? That is really important when you get into personal data, obviously. But it's the same thing is true for financial data, investor data, and the like. You need to have clarity around who has rights to access that data.
So we have discussed it in previous episodes, but one of those biggest obstacles we encounter when we implement these new structures and tech commonly revolves around that organization's bottom line. So how do we, one, define these investments in data management, and two, frame them as a capital investment producing value rather than just something that is only an expense?
So this question gets headlong into, or runs headlong, I should say, directly into the question of financial accounting and financial management practices, not just in oil and gas, but across industry. Because, if you start from the point of view that your information is an asset, then you will create a balance sheet entry for it, or have a phantom balance sheet entry where you place value on that asset. Whereas the traditional history of data is it's largely viewed as an expense. And of course, once it's viewed as an expense, then you treat it quite differently in the context of the industry. So as an example here, let me just show a funny cartoon that gets at this exact question. And the woman at the desk is saying, please explain why I shouldn't be getting rid of you because you blew $40,000 on some exercise cleaning up data that didn't seem to offer any real value. Unfortunately, this is all too common in the industry. Is even if you feel like you're, as a manager, you may be called to the carpet because you spent a lot of money cleaning up data assets. You might resist or not bother investing time and energy in that kind of project. But in fact, this is a really, really important activity. And these are the sorts of considerations I come across frequently. The investments in technical standards, investments in hiring the right talent or people who know how to do this sort of thing, making sure that the work that their people are carrying out is measured and rewarded correctly and is viewed positively. This is all part and parcel of this question about getting your house in order around data. And it's a big order. It will feel, as someone once said to me, it feels like you're digging this huge hole, a foundation for a building, where what people really want is the building. But first you have to dig this big hole. And you just have to get your head around it that to deal with the legacy challenge, we're going to have to spend some money to get things fixed. But once we've fixed it and we've got the right infrastructure in place, the future is a lot brighter around data and how data. In fact, in some tech companies have shown very clearly, data quality should be free. If you're doing it right, it shouldn't cost you much of anything at all, because it generally can be machine generated and clean from the get-go.
Perfect. So the new ideas are implemented, the goals are structured, and the work can actually start. But what initiatives should an organization consider implementing to ensure that those all the way down the corporate ladder accept these changes and work with them the way that they were intended?
Well, this is a classic change management question that you encounter over and over again in business, so change, of course, starts at the top. These initiatives in the practice in industry where they're the most successful is where there's a strong management-led messaging and promotion of these kinds of initiatives so that they take root. One of the things you learn very quickly in this area is that the changes that are going to take place so that data quality improves is not just isolated to one or two parts of the company. This becomes much more of a cultural DNA the way we work. Messaging that takes place, that we have to take very high care on the quality of the information assets that we're doing. And of course, you have to create space in people's day so that they can do what you're asking them to do, which by definition means looking at the sorts of things that they're doing that are robbing them from the time and attention to make sure data assets are clear, and you free them up so that they've got that bit of capacity to do it. Back to my mobile app example for my field worker, if you make the app easy to use, accessible where they're doing their job out on a job site, working in all kinds of conditions, on grid, off grid, online, offline, in all kinds of weather conditions, and you make it easy to use, employees will collect the information correctly, perfectly, reliably every time. It's just easier for them. So but that's a management question. If you're not prepared to put the time and energy to build that infrastructure for your people, you don't be surprised if the information asset quality is not very good.
And then sometimes we make mistakes we didn't even mean to. I remember in my data analytics course, a big first lesson for everybody was, well, that exact thing, the standardization of data. We made a big data lake of EOR projects across the country, but once we sorted that sheet later, someone typing polymer injection with a capital P, capital I was different than polymer injection, all lowercase. So how do companies govern the data as it is created and logged?
Well, one of the ways to do that is that you create some data standards or data practices that provide guidance to your employees, in addition to people who are designing the tools to do the data collection, that this is your standard of how you do this. And if the standards have to be memorized, you have to be very clear about this. If you are expecting your employees to memorize that the first letter in polymer is always capitalized and the I in injector is never capitalized, if your employees are being expected to memorize that standard, then you're good luck. But if you at least you know that anytime you say have a company name in your database, that it is going to be structured in all caps or first letter capitalized, or it's exactly the way the company's registered with the stock exchange or on a company registry, then at least you at least put the first basic standard in place for how that data is going to look. It's shocking sometimes you get into data sets and you realize how many variations there are possible for simple things. But putting these guardrails in place, this guidance in place, these data standards rules are exactly what's required. As the cartoon makes clear, it's very, very cheap to create data. It's unbelievably inexpensive, free. Like, look how take a photograph of 3 megabytes and it's just a press of a button. But fixing the data after you've fixed it or you created it is very, very expensive. And so the more energy in upfront generates a big payoff down the road.
And all right, we've got Project Genesis. The ball's been put into motion and the organization is beginning to implement their new data program. But how can a company ensure that it stays on the rails? What is important for monitoring progress to prevent reverting back to old habits of data storage and continually improving that process as you grow?
Well, certainly there's a significant education component here. So you have to train and teach your people what it is your expectations are. And to the extent that companies lack basic foundational training or education on what data is and how you use it correctly and the power and importance of keeping it clean, you can't expect people to naturally cotton on to this because it's these older behaviors are so deeply seated. So once you land your standards of what you want your data to look like and for the purposes for which you're going to be using it, then you can put the education programs in place to teach your people how to work in that context. Then you can do things like have your backward check to see, okay, so are we on track here? Are people doing what we need them to do to improve data quality? That can help us find out where maybe there's an intervention needed. Maybe there's a part of the organization that's particularly weak here. You find these sorts of behaviors that the programs we put into place to improve our safety culture, for instance, follow a very similar pattern. You have to educate, and then you put into place your systems and processes. You run them. You identify where you've got outliers and where you need to have additional safety performance. Then you go in and conduct interventions to move people along. Eventually, you reach a point where you say, okay, you're clearly not getting it. Maybe you're not suited to this kind of role responsibility. Then you start moving people around so that you start getting the right people into the right spots. Other techniques that come into play here are tools like gamification, where you motivate and reward using these clever social tools, higher quality information. So you give away badges, for instance, or tokens because so-and-so is particularly good at making sure the data in spreadsheets is crystal clean and clear. And so all of these factors taken together are the sorts of things that you need to move your data assets up in quality and reliability. And as I say, the oil and gas knows how to do this, but we just don't do it with data. We do it with things like safety. And so what we need to do is bring that kind of culture into the data world.
So the benefits of using these techniques of data collection and management are too big to be ignored. But I can easily see someone, well, like myself, getting overzealous in the implementation and introducing an absolutely daunting amount of work to my team. So how does someone know how big of a bite to take, so to speak?
Yeah, this is again, another challenge that managers will face. And the size of the bite actually is going to be quite different depending on what part of the business you're in and what the quality is of the data that you're after and how far behind you are and the urgency of your context. So there isn't a clean and tight answer to how big a bite you should take, but take a bite you must. And so it does start with making that first move. The place where I typically counsel is with organizations is that they start with a clear business problem in mind that they want to solve, something that has some real business pain, and you take aim there because once you start correcting the pain. In other words, you make a business problem go away, and you've done that by improving the quality of the data that you're working with, and you fix the process around that business pain. People will get the message. They will see the results for themselves, which makes the future efforts to drive change forward by fixing data assets much more palatable. What I find that doesn't work very well is when you say, well, I'm going to go clean up all of my data, because that feels really pointless to people. They don't understand what you're trying to do. So what you should be doing is take a very, very clear look at where you've got a business pain that you can solve. At some level, there will, and this is a back and forth, because at a business unit or team level, that maybe the data that you're after is quite constrained or quite tight. Whereas if you're in a corporate setting, it could be a much larger bite. I worked for an oil refinery company many years ago who was trying to fix, it was trying to figure out which parts of its business were actually financially successful. You have to think about how challenging that could be. They didn't know. So what did they tackle? They tackled all of their financial data and to move it, to make it better quality. That's a big bite. That's a really big bite. Another project I was on, the task was quite straightforward. It was a crew shift issue in an oil sands mine. And what happened is the productivity of the mine would go down when you had a crew shift because the crews get off of the equipment and the new crew comes on. So the truck stopped driving. It's as simple as that. So the question was, how could you raise the performance of the shift by staggering the shift across trucks? Not that every truck stops running all at the same time and then they all step up. You stagger them, and then you could smooth out the shift. Well, what data would you go after then? Well, it was a lot simpler. It was crews and crew shifts and timing of shifts and so forth. And collecting that data was a much easier task. So the bite depends on the problem that you're trying to solve. And of course, the question after that is and go back to my two examples. For a crew shift, the shifts were happening every 8 hours. So the timeline was we need to tackle is much shorter. Whereas in finance, if you're trying to figure out which economic part of your business is making money, well, maybe your timeline is over a year. So again, it just depends. There isn't a clean answer for this one. But as I say, the starting point is always the same, a real business problem.
So now I want to talk money. We discussed earlier that data management needs to be framed as an investment that will ultimately create value for the organization rather than be a liability. So intrinsic value and cost realization of new tech is often misunderstood, or the benefits are often simply ignored. Any tools you have to introduce so we can change this attitude?
Well, there are three things that I've seen that I've watched companies deploy with some measure of success. One is to establish some metrics that could be quite arbitrary, but are still metrics nonetheless, that are targeting the outcomes that companies are after. And that could be things as simple as an error rate within your data quality, within a specific data set, as one example, all the way to a dollar value to be placed on data assets. I worked for a company many years ago who the only metric they had was the cost of data of disk servers. And so they looked at this growing cost of data, which was measured in real dollars associated with disk servers. And they created a chargeback mechanism back to the business unit to say, you're paying for this storage. How do these data assets, you need to manage your costs down somehow, which forced the business units to identify which data assets they wanted to hold were worth storing on computer storage that was expensive. So that was a way that they kind of solved the question. This gets into real, what I call management accounting challenges. Like, how do you think about this from a management accounting standpoint as opposed to a financial accounting standpoint? Second technique is to create in your capital process a specific sets of metrics associated with data assets. And so that they are not left behind or unfunded during the capital cycle. An example of this is I mentioned earlier in this episode. When you're building an asset, the information that you keep that's created by the engineering and procurement world is structured in a fashion that's different from how you want that information when you get into your operational world. And so how do you create an incentive and a metric structure that motivates company and people to create really accurate data for those two purposes, not just for one and then the other, but how do you do that? So embedding that directly into your capital process is another technique. And of course, third is to take focus on how these data assets are ultimately going to generate value for your company, and making sure that that there's a recognition of that value. This gets into things like for particular kinds of data sets, creating a value for them. They might not show up on your financial asset registry or indeed on your publicly traded balance sheet, but you might actually have a separate set of statements that help people appreciate the value of those assets. And that's a couple of three techniques I've seen companies use.
So the final product from a successful data management plan is verified, correct, and usable data that can create value for the organization. But there's one little wrinkle I'd still like to iron out. Like you mentioned, this data can be difficult to compare between various segments of an organization. So a well here, a well there, a well anywhere. How do we make sure that a company has defined and standardized metrics for comparing different types of information?
Yeah, so here a well, there a well, everywhere a well. You know, it's a farmer McDonald. So how do you do that? Is one of the ways is back to, as I mentioned earlier, is these subtle accounting measures that can allocate or attribute value to things is one way to do it. That of course, to be clear, you need to always tie that back to what the business is trying to accomplish, so that you don't create a perversion in the incentive structure. To use an example from our gamification episode, you create a company of excellent gamers, but they're not actually generating value for you. So you have to be. This takes some real energy and some work to get this right. You don't have the metrics in turn driving the wrong behavior. But clearly, understanding what the economics are that drive your business, and then identifying the data that you need to drive those, push those drivers forward, is a great starting point. In my book, I described a technique called the creation of the value tree. And so you take your business structure, balance sheet, and income statement. You keep parsing those down till you get to the specific end element of your tree, where you can be very precise. A unit of throughput on a particular piece of equipment yields this much incremental production. You can get very, very surgical in identifying through value tree structures exactly what data you need so that you drive value in your business. And so that's a very, very useful technique to get there, so that you are much more precise in your thinking about what data that you really need.
So let's wrap everything up. Again, we've taken this data monster, this beast, and we've reduced it into something useful. So what are some of those major stepping stones that a company needs to begin with to set up and maintain a data strategy? What are those key areas management should make sure to include if they take anything else from this episode?
Well, the first and foremost is to look beyond oil and gas for inspiration on how to do this really, really well. There are other industries that are so much further ahead, and lessons that they have taken on board absolutely are relevant to our industry. So I would, as a first step, benchmark yourself to the best in the world and see what they're up to. Those organizations are just so much better at this than oil and gas. Next is landing how mechanically and structurally you will tackle this data question internally. Gets into this, as we talked about, data standards and data ownership, and who's got what accountability, and what's their authority to drive change. That in turn translates into setting performance metrics and targets for people to achieve. And that will ultimately inform capital spend. Like, where do you allocate your money to do this? And maybe that's in reimagining a web front end of some system you've got, which becomes critical to collecting data for you. And you redo that so that it is much easier and more simpler for people to engage with. And then finally, and most critically, because there's an unlimited amount of data that you can deal with in any industry, and in most companies, it's unbounded. So you have to bind it somewhere. And my advice always is you start with a business problem, either the drivers of the business or a specific business pain point. And that's your, as you call it, you said earlier, Tavis, in this session, where's your first bite? That's the first bite. Take aim at a business problem.
Alrighty, so that is the end of this episode. We learned a whole lot, and although we don't always agree on definitions, I think the one definition we can agree on is Jeffrey and how he is just a never-ending well of knowledge, and he can share that knowledge with you through his book, Bits, Bytes, and Barrels. I mean, I know we've been promoting it the whole time, but really, we're promoting it because it is useful, especially for you if you want to move into the future. So go to his website, buy a copy of his book, physical copies through Amazon, digital through also Amazon, or even listen to it like I do on Audible. Outside of that, he's got other courses and plenty of information. Bring it over to the Rare Petro side of things. We've got a lot of stuff too. Plenty of Monday news, research every Thursday through periodicals that you can listen to or read. Lots of stuff. But I won't sell you on anything else. Jeffrey, is there anything else you'd like to say before we end this episode?
One thing I wanted to just draw attention to is a new book that I've been part of. This book is coming out in March, and it's called Machine Learning and Data Science for Upstream Oil and Gas. And it's chock full of examples and case studies about the use of machine tools in improving upstream oil and gas, and in particular, data science and this whole world of data and data management. So if you're interested in this topic, and you should be, because it's critical to the success of the industry, you might want to take a close eye at this book when it comes to market as well.
And then I'll be sure to provide any information and links to that as well. So that is the end of this episode. Again, thank you for joining us, and until we see you next time, take care, everybody.